A lone cowgirl had carved out a solitary existence for years, until the evening 7 handsome widowers appeared at her door, asking for a place to stay. But what Roxanne Cassidy glimpsed in their gazes during that tempestuous night was not the mark of desperation. It was a look far more menacing. A mournful wind screamed across the flatlands like a beast in pain, shaking every plank of Roxanne's time-worn ranch house. She stood by her kitchen window, the mug of coffee in her work-roughened hands had long gone cool, as she observed the storm clouds consuming the final flickers of twilight. For 8 solitary years, no one had crossed her property without an invitation. For 8 years, that was precisely how she wanted it. The sudden sound of hooves splashing through the downpour made her stiffen. Peering through the torrents of rain sheeting off her roof, she could just discern 7 riders, their dark forms hunched low against the gale. They were all men, riding with a frantic energy that spoke of having no other place to turn. Roxanne placed her cup down with a deliberate and unhurried motion. Her hand drifted instinctively toward the rifle resting over the mantel, but she hesitated. These were not highwaymen or cattle rustlers, yet something about their formation, too tight, too synchronized, too driven, sent a chill down her spine. The man in the lead was the first to dismount. Even in the deluge, Roxanne could tell he was commanding. Dark hair was slicked to his forehead, and his traveling clothes, though torn, were clearly of fine quality. He strode to her door with the assurance of a man who was used to having his way. The other 6 stayed on their horses, their features obscured by the brims of their hats, but their postures radiated the weariness of men who had witnessed the worst of humanity. The man called, his voice sharp enough to slice through the wind. "We beg your pardon, but we need shelter for the night." Roxanne observed them from behind the glass. Something felt profoundly wrong. 7 men, traveling unaccompanied through this desolate country in weather that could fell a seasoned frontiersman, was unheard of. And their mounts. These were not the broken-down creatures of desperate men. The animals were well-muscled and obviously cherished. She recalled her mother's advice, given to her long ago: a person's true nature is revealed in how they treat those who can offer them nothing in return. But her mother had never encountered men who moved with the discipline of soldiers and whose smiles concealed untold secrets. The dark-haired man knocked again, with more force this time. "Please, Tim. We'll never reach town in this storm." Roxanne moved toward the door, her boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. Every fiber of her being urged her to leave the door bolted. 8 years of isolation had taught her that other people were a source of pain and complication. Yet the storm was intensifying. And even if these men were fugitives, she couldn't stand by and let them perish on her land. Her hand paused over the latch. She could hear them murmuring outside, their voices too low to decipher, perhaps strategizing or simply trying to keep warm. She could not know that by opening that door, every principle she held about good and evil, trust and deception, and the steep price of solitude would be challenged in ways that would make her wonder if some kindnesses were worth their terrible cost. Because these 7 men had not stumbled upon her ranch by mere chance, and the storm that delivered them to her was a gentle breeze compared to the tempest they were about to bring into her life. Roxanne swung the door open, and the storm barreled in like an aggressive intruder. The dark-haired man stood before her, rain dripping from his coat, but his blue eyes showed no hint of gratitude, only sharp assessment. Behind him, the 6 other men had already dismounted and were guiding their horses to her barn as if they owned the place. "My thanks," he said, stepping over the threshold before she could reconsider. "I am Julian Thorne. These are my associates." The slight hesitation he placed on the word associates made Roxanne's jaw clench. She watched as the men secured their horses with a military-like efficiency, as if they had performed this routine 1,000 times. These were not helpless widowers trapped by the weather. These were men with an agenda. "Where are you headed?" Roxanne inquired, shutting the door but keeping her body angled toward her rifle. "Oregon," he answered seamlessly, shrugging off his coat to show a tailored vest that had cost more than she earned in a year. "My late wife left me land there. We all lost our wives recently. We decided to travel as a group for protection." The other men entered one by one, each more strikingly handsome than the last, and each possessing that same peculiar blend of raw vulnerability and latent threat. There was a fair-haired man, no older than 25, with eyes that held ancient sorrows, a man with scars across his knuckles that hinted at a violent past, and another with a constant, unnerving smile who seemed to miss nothing. They offered their thanks in smooth, deep voices, but their eyes roamed her cabin, taking inventory of every object. The way they arranged themselves in her small living area, never turning their backs on one another and always maintaining a clear line to the exit, made her blood turn to ice. "We're incredibly thankful for your hospitality," offered the youngest of them, his long eyelashes fluttering. "We've been on the trail for days. Haven't passed another living soul in miles." That was an outright lie. Roxanne had spotted a plume of dust from a party of riders earlier that day, perhaps 3 hours behind these men. Someone was on their trail, and they were well aware of it. "The coffee's still hot," Roxanne said, putting them to the test. "Pour yourselves a cup while I check on your horses." "Oh, there's no need to trouble yourself," Julian interjected swiftly. "The animals are taken care of. We are perfectly capable of seeing to our own needs." Another warning bell sounded. Men in this part of the country, especially in such weather, never turned down an offer of help with their stock. And the way Julian's hand repeatedly strayed to a bulge hidden inside his coat told Roxanne he was armed and prepared to use his weapon. She went to the kitchen, pouring coffee with hands that were firm despite the alarm shrieking in her mind. Through the window, she could see their horses in her barn. Magnificent animals with fine saddles, but the froth on their muzzles indicated they had been ridden to their limits. They were fleeing something, not on a leisurely journey to Oregon. "This is a fine homestead you have here," remarked the man with the scarred hands, touching the fabric of her curtains. "It must be lonely for a woman out here by herself." "I like it that way," Roxanne stated, passing out tin mugs. Fewer complications. The men shared brief, loaded glances that confirmed her suspicions. Their arrival was no accident, and they had no intention of departing peacefully at sunrise. As thunder boomed overhead, Julian moved to her window and stared out into the blackness. "A dreadful night to be caught in the open," he said softly. "It's fortunate we came across your ranch when we did." But the way he scanned the road, the stiffness in his posture, told Roxanne he wasn't concerned about the storm. He was watching for their pursuers. And when those riders finally came, because she knew they would, Roxanne would be caught in a conflict that would make this squall feel like a summer shower. What she didn't grasp yet was that she had sealed her fate the moment she unbolted her door. By dawn, she would either be dead or she would learn that sometimes the most lethal predators arrive disguised as weary travelers. The clock on Roxanne's mantel chimed 9, each toll reverberating through the thick, tense air of the cabin. The men had made themselves comfortable in her home, but their gazes were in constant motion, ever watchful, ever appraising. Julian remained by the window, his focus on the storm as sharp as a hawk's. "Tell me of your wives," Roxanne said, easing into her own chair with her coffee. "What sorts of women were they?" The question landed in the room with the force of a physical impact. The fair-haired man, who had identified himself as Leo, almost fumbled his cup. The smiling man's grin wavered for the first time. But Julian turned from the window, his expression cold enough to extinguish a fire. "They are dead," he stated flatly. "And best not spoken of." Roxanne gave a slow nod, her eyes moving from one face to the next. "It's a strange thing about widowers in this territory. Most travel with kin or folks from their town. Most don't look like they're expecting a fight. And most don't conceal pistols inside their coats." The man with the scarred knuckles, Marcus, shifted his weight, and Roxanne saw the glint of a revolver tucked into his waistband. "A man traveling alone needs to be able to defend himself," he said, his tone defensive. 7 men traveling alone, Roxanne countered. 7 handsome men on expensive horses, wearing fine clothes, and carrying enough weaponry between you to supply a posse. That doesn't sound like widowers on their way to Oregon. That sounds like something else entirely. The youngest man, who had been nearly silent since his arrival, suddenly shot to his feet. His hands trembled as tears welled in his eyes. "I can't do this," he choked out. "I can't continue this charade." "Sit down, Finn," Julian ordered, his voice like cracking ice. But Finn shook his head, stumbling back toward the door. "She's shown us nothing but decency, and we're about to." He trailed off, unable to voice the thought. The atmosphere in the cabin plunged. All the other men were now glaring at Finn with looks that mixed rage with sheer panic. Roxanne felt her own hand inching toward her rifle, the truth finally solidifying in her mind like a frozen puddle. "About to what, Finn?" she prompted gently. Before the young man could reply, the sound of more horses thundered through the storm, riding hard despite the treacherous conditions. Julian whirled toward the window, his face draining of color. "They found us," he breathed. The other men were instantly on their feet, revealing a small arsenal of weapons that had been hidden under their travel dusters. Derringers, long knives, and even a compact shotgun that the smiling man produced from a satchel. "Who found you?" Roxanne demanded, rising from her chair. Julian turned to her, and for the very first time, she saw raw fear in his eyes. "The men we robbed," he admitted. "Men who have been hunting us for 3 days across 2 territories." The pieces slammed into place with brutal clarity. These weren't widowers. They were outlaws, and they had just led a band of vengeful killers right to her doorstep. "How much did you take?" Roxanne asked. "Enough to make them exceedingly angry," Julian answered. The riders were drawing nearer. Through the storm's roar, Roxanne could hear them shouting, their coarse voices filled with threats of brutal retribution. Finn was now openly weeping, while the other men were methodically checking their weapons with the proficiency of seasoned killers. But what they didn't know, what Roxanne hadn't shared with a soul in 8 long years, was that before she had become a reclusive cowgirl, she had been someone else. Someone whose skills might just be enough to keep them all breathing until morning, provided she decided they were worth the risk. The posse swarmed into Roxanne's yard like specters from a nightmare. Through the rain-streaked windows, she saw at least 8 men, possibly more. Their leader, a hulking man in a long black coat, dismounted and started yelling orders that sliced through the gale. "Fan out! Check the barn! If they're in there, I want them breathing." Julian seized Roxanne's arm, his grip like a vice. "Please," he whispered, his veneer of confidence completely gone. "They will slaughter us if they catch us." Roxanne looked into his eyes and saw a familiar terror, the kind that comes from knowing the depths of cruelty men are capable of when they believe they've been wronged. She had seen that expression before, in her own reflection and in the eyes of people she'd been unable to save. "What was it you stole from them?" she pressed. "Money," Marcus answered. "A fortune from a high-stakes card game in Deadwood." "How much?" "Enough to purchase a small county," Leo whispered. Finn was huddled in a corner, rocking and muttering. "They'll do unspeakable things to us. Things far worse than killing." A ferocious banging on Roxanne's door made everyone flinch. The voice that followed was gravelly, menacing, and utterly assured of its authority. "Open this door. We know you've got Yem in there." Roxanne looked at the 7 men, truly seeing them now. Underneath the fine clothes and the weapons, behind the lies and the desperation, she saw something that reminded her of her brother who was dead because no one had been there to stand up for him when wicked men came to call. She reached for her rifle, then paused. Instead, she strode to a loose floorboard beside the hearth, pried it up, and revealed a hidden cache of firearms that made the men's collection look like children's playthings. Military-grade rifles, boxes of ammunition, and another object that made Julian's eyes go wide with shock. "You're not just a cowgirl," he breathed. "I used to be a marshal," Roxanne said, checking the action on a repeating rifle. "Before I gave up on civilization." The door imploded, sending wood splinters flying through the air. The first man to charge in was built like a bear, with a face full of scars and eyes that promised only more violence. He was followed by others, all of them hard-bitten men who looked like they would trade their own kin for a bottle of rye. "Well now," the leader drawled, rain dripping from his hat. "Roxanne Cassidy. I heard you'd gone soft, playing rancher out in the middle of nowhere's." "Hello, Cormac," Roxanne replied, her voice as steady as granite. "Still running errands for men too cowardly to handle their own affairs." Cormac Doolan. Roxanne should have guessed. The man was infamous for tracking down people who wanted to stay lost and making them regret ever being born. His presence meant these men had robbed someone with formidable influence. "Just give us the men, Roxanne, and we'll be on our way." "This doesn't concern you." "I'm afraid it already does," she said, planting herself between Cormac and the 7 men. "They asked for shelter. I gave them my word." Cormac let out a laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Your word? To a pack of thieves? They stole from the wrong people, Roxanne. Money that belongs to men who have long memories and no capacity for forgiveness." "Then maybe they should have been more careful about who they played poker with. Hand them over, or we'll take them, and we'll burn this place to the ground with you in it." Roxanne met Cormac's stare without a flicker of fear. You can try. The silence that descended was heavy with the promise of bloodshed. 8 armed thugs against 1 former lawwoman and 7 desperate men. The odds were grim, the situation untenable, and the storm outside was nothing compared to the one about to erupt in that little cabin. But Cormac was unaware of the secret Roxanne had guarded for 8 years, the true reason she had abandoned her life as a marshal. And when the bullets started flying, that secret was about to turn a certain massacre into something far more unpredictable. The standoff was a wire pull to its breaking point. Cormac's men had fanned out inside Roxanne's small home, their guns aimed at the cluster of men sheltering behind the former marshal. The storm outside seemed to have paused, as if waiting for the carnage to commence. "You know, Roxanne," Cormac said, methodically pulling off his soaked gloves, "I've heard some peculiar tales about why you really quit the marshal service. Something about a bank job up in Silver Creek. Something about crucial evidence that just vanished." Roxanne's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue. Behind her, she could feel Julian's eyes on her back, re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about his unlikely savior. "Oh, yes," Cormac went on, relishing the moment. "Seems a whole lot of money never found its way back to the bank's vault. Makes you wonder how a simple lawwoman could afford a spread like this." "You're wasting your breath, Cormac." "Am I?" Cormac nodded to his men, and they cocked their weapons. "See, the way I see it, you and these fellas have a lot in common. You're all thieves. The only difference is, you got away clean." Finn let out a whimper from the corner, and Leo's hand was so tight on his derringer that his knuckles were white. Marcus was scanning the room, searching for any tactical advantage, while the smiling man, Faye, seemed almost gleeful at the prospect of a fight. But it was Julian who did the unexpected. He stepped forward, moving past Roxanne's protective shield to confront Cormac face to face. "The money we took," he said, his voice low but firm. "It wasn't from a poker game. It was a payment. For children. Young children being bought and sold like livestock." The room fell utterly silent. Even Cormac's hardened men traded uneasy looks. "We didn't steal from gamblers," Julian continued, his voice rising with conviction. "We stole from monsters who profit from human suffering. Monsters who prey on the innocent." "That's a nice tale," Cormac sneered, but a flicker of uncertainty had entered his eyes. "Doesn't change that you took what wasn't yours. It was never theirs to begin with." Marcus spoke up, his own pistol now drawn. Every single dollar was stained with a child's fear. Roxanne looked at the men with a dawning comprehension. They weren't just thieves, they were avengers, delivering a form of justice the law seemed unable to provide. It explained their discipline, their weaponry, their meticulous planning. These men weren't running to Oregon, they were running to save others. "Makes no difference to me," Cormac said, but his voice had lost its earlier bravado. "A job is a job. Money is money, even blood money." Roxanne challenged. "Especially blood money. It pays the best." In that instant, Roxanne made her decision. Not merely to shield 7 men, but to confront the very evil that had haunted her for years. The same evil she had failed to defeat in Silver Creek. The same darkness that had sent her into self-imposed exile. She moved with a speed that defied her years. The rifle was in her hands and spoke before Cormac could even think to draw his own weapon. The shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to his knees. "Does anyone else want to argue the ethics of child slavery?" Roxanne asked, cycling the lever on her rifle. The remaining thugs now faced not just a former marshal with a lifetime of combat knowledge, but 7 men who had already proven they would kill for their cause. The odds had just taken a dramatic turn, and the storm outside was about to feel like a tranquil afternoon compared to the judgment that was about to be delivered. The cabin erupted in gunfire. Cormac's men, startled by Roxanne's explosive action and the damning revelation about their employers, faltered for a critical moment. That single moment of hesitation was their undoing. Julian's derringer fired twice, taking down the man closest to the door. Leo and Marcus moved with a fluid, deadly grace, their shots finding their marks with chilling accuracy. Faye let out a wild laugh as he fired, a sound more unnerving than any battle cry. Only Finn stayed cowering in the corner, sobbing as the room exploded in violence around him. Roxanne handled her rifle like an extension of her own body, each shot measured and lethal. 8 years of quiet solitude had not diminished her skills. If anything, the isolation had honed her senses and solidified her resolve. These men had invaded her home to collect a human payment. They would be carried out as freight. "Fall back!" Cormac shrieked, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Get to the horses!" But there was no escape. The storm still raged, transforming the world outside into a black, howling chaos. And within the cabin, 7 men and 1 former marshal had converted her humble home into a deadly trap. One of Cormac's men lunged for Finn, grabbing the terrified young man and holding a knife to his neck. "Drop your guns or he dies." It was then that Roxanne saw it, a small brand on the man's wrist, just visible under his grimy cuff. A symbol she had seen before, in Silver Creek. On the wrist of a dead boy who couldn't have been more than 12. The very mark these men were fighting. "You know what that sigil means, don't you?" Julian called out, noticing Roxanne's frozen stare. "You've seen it." Roxanne had seen it. On victims, on pieces of evidence that had gone missing, on bodies that were dismissed as accidents. The brand of a syndicate that treated human life as a commodity, that bought and sold children to the wealthiest bidders. "Silver Creek," she whispered, the full picture flooding her mind. "That's why the evidence vanished. That's why the investigation was shut down. Your own people were on the payroll," Marcus confirmed, his pistol still aimed at Cormac. Judges, sheriffs, congressmen, all of them. The man holding Finn pressed the blade harder against his throat. "I said, drop your weapons." Instead, Roxanne did something that stunned them all. She carefully set down her rifle and reached into her tunic, pulling out a small metal star. Not her old marshal's badge. Something else. Something that made Cormac's eyes widen with a new, profound terror. "Federal Marshal," Roxanne said softly. "Special Investigative Division. I've been hunting your organization for 8 years." The cabin fell deathly silent, save for the storm's fury outside. Cormac gaped at the badge as if it were a venomous snake. "The Hermit Act," Julian breathed. "It was all a cover, deep cover," Roxanne affirmed, her gaze fixed on the man holding Finn. "Waiting for the perfect chance to cut the head off this entire operation, you son of a..." Cormac snarled. "You've been playing us this whole time. 8 years, Roxanne repeated. 8 years of watching, listening, mapping out your entire network. Your employers, your routes, your buyers. Every name, every ledger, every deal." The man with the knife was sweating profusely now, realizing he was trapped between federal law and 7 men who had already shown their deadly intent. His hand trembled as he held the blade to Finn's skin. "Let him go," Roxanne said calmly. "And I'll see to it you live long enough to stand trials." "Against who?" the man sputtered. "Everyone," Roxanne promised. "Every politician who took your bribes. Every judge who turned a blind eye. Every lawman who buried a case. I have 8 years of proof hidden where your masters can never touch it." "You're bluffing," Roxanne smiled, and it was the most chilling expression anyone in that room had ever witnessed. "Try me." The man's nerve broke. His knife hand faltered, and in that split second of indecision, Finn proved he was far from weak. He slammed an elbow into the man's gut and twisted free, leaving his captor exposed to 7 furious men with 7 loaded guns. What came next would be the last thing Cormac ever saw. The man who had threatened Finn was dead before he touched the ground. 7 guns spoke in a single, deafening roar, turning him into an object lesson on the folly of underestimating desperate men. The sound was a final, absolute judgment. Cormac, bleeding and defeated, looked at the ruin of his posse. Bodies were strewn across Roxanne's furniture, their blood staining the floorboards that had known only peaceful solitude for 8 years. Only 2 of his men were still alive, both wounded, both staring at the federal badge in Roxanne's hand as if it were their own execution order. "You played every one of us," Cormac rasped, clutching his shoulder. "All this time, you were a Fed all this time, you were filth," Roxanne retorted, holstering her sidearm. "The difference is, I was on the right side of the law." Julian lowered his still-smoking pistol, his blue eyes appraising Roxanne with a newfound awe. 8 years. 8 years of watching children get stolen. 8 years of building a case. That requires a unique kind of patience, it requires a unique kind of rage, Roxanne corrected him. A cold rage. The kind that doesn't flare up and die. It just burns hotter and deeper. Finn had stopped weeping. He stood over the corpse of his would-be murderer, his youthful features now forged into something harder than sorrow, purer than revenge. "How many kids?" he asked quietly. "How many what?" Cormac gasped. "How many children did your masters buy and sell? How many lives were ruined to pay for your dirty money?" Cormac attempted a laugh, but it turned into a bloody cough. "You think killing us changes anything? You think this is the end?" "No," Roxanne said, kneeling by the dying man. "This is the beginning. You see, I didn't just spend 8 years watching. I spent 8 years compiling names, dates, ledgers, locations, your entire operation, documented where?" Cormac demanded. "Safe," Roxanne answered. "In federal hands. And now that you've confirmed my intelligence by showing up here, by admitting what these men stole, by wearing that brand, well, now I have all I need to dismantle the entire syndicate." Marcus moved to the window, scanning for any other threats. "Is it really done?" he asked. "For us, it is," Julian said, finally letting a sliver of hope into his voice. He looked at Roxanne. "What about the men at the top? The ones who stay clean?" "They're finished," Roxanne stated with certainty. "All of them. Federal teams are moving on safe houses in 3 territories as we speak. By sunrise, the organization that destroyed so many lives will be gone." The storm outside was at last starting to subside. Through the splintered doorway, the first light of dawn was painting the horizon with colors of promise and absolution. But inside the ranch house, surrounded by bodies and blood, 7 men and 1 federal marshal sat in the quiet aftermath of their private war. "What about us?" Leo asked. "We're still wanted men." "We still stole money," evidence, Roxanne corrected. "Confiscated during a federal operation." "You gentlemen were assisting a marshal in the execution of a warrant." Faye laughed, a sound that was lighter now, cleansed of its earlier mania. "So we're heroes then, you're survivors," Roxanne replied. "And sometimes, that's the same thing." But as the morning light filled the cabin, exposing the full extent of the night's violence, Roxanne wondered if any of them could truly escape the darkness they had confronted. Victory always came with a cost, and sometimes that cost was paid in pieces of one soul that could never be reclaimed. The question that remained was whether what they had saved was worth what they had lost. The sun rose higher, casting a golden glow on Roxanne's ranch that felt almost blasphemous after the night's savagery. The storm had moved on, leaving a landscape that looked scrubbed and new. Inside the cabin, however, the brutal evidence of their battle remained in the form of drying blood and the sharp tang of gunpowder. Cormac had expired before dawn, his final breath a curse on the world. His 2 surviving men sat tied and silent, awaiting the arrival of the marshals Roxanne had signaled. The syndicate that had preyed on the innocent across half the West was shattered. But the price of that victory hung heavy in the air. Finn had found his voice. "What becomes of us now?" he asked. He was no longer the terrified youth who had wept in the corner. The night had remade him, tempering him with a steel that could prove to be either a great strength or a great danger. "You vanish," Roxanne answered, meticulously cleaning her rifle with the focus of someone who knew the value of proper maintenance. "New identities, new histories, new towns. The government can arrange such things as a group, or separately." Julian asked, his tone implying he already knew the answer. "That's your decision." But you have to understand, you can never be those men again. The men who came to my door last night are gone. The ones who leave today are new. Marcus nodded, accepting the gravity of her words. Perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps those men deserve to die. The sound of approaching riders made them all instinctively reach for their weapons. But these men rode in the full light of day, with federal stars on their chests and official documents in hand. The cleanup detail had arrived to manage the scene, to remove the dead, to distill a night of righteous slaughter into neat bureaucratic reports destined for a dusty file cabinet. Marshal Williams, the lead rider, said, dismounting with crisp authority. You signaled the operation was a success. Complete and successful, Roxanne confirmed. The network is crippled. The evidence is accounted for. These men are now under federal protection. Marshal Williams gave the 7 men a long, assessing look, the kind of look a man gets after seeing too much of the world to be shocked by anything. They'll require new papers, full backstories. That's a costly business. They paid the price, Roxanne stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Paid in blood. The most expensive currency there is. As the federal unit started its grim work, the 7 men readied themselves to leave the woman who had saved not just their lives, but perhaps their souls as well. Finn lingered behind, approaching Roxanne with a newfound diffidence. The money we took, he said softly. What will happen to it? What would you want to happen to it? Roxanne asked. There are places, he whispered. Havens for children who've been rescued. Places that need money, need walls, need someone to watch over them. Roxanne nodded, understanding perfectly. I will personally see that it gets where it needs to go. Julian was the last to speak with her. You could have turned us over, he said. Claimed the bounty, gone back to your peaceful life. Peace isn't a destination you arrive at, Roxanne replied. It's a choice you make, day after day. Last night, I chose to side with men who were fighting to protect the innocent. For people like me, that's as close to peace as it gets. And you? What's next for the deep-cover federal marshal? Roxanne glanced around her home, now stained and scarred by the violence it had hosted. I believe my cover has been compromised, she said with the ghost of a smile. Time to find a new war to fight. The men rode out as the sun reached its zenith, heading toward new futures with new names, a second chance few people ever get. They melted into the vast landscape, leaving behind only the memory that justice can sometimes arise from the most unlikely of alliances. Roxanne stood in her doorway and watched them go, reflecting on 8 years of patient waiting and a single night of brutal, decisive purpose. The house would need to be scrubbed, repaired, and exorcised of its ghosts. But for the first time in almost a decade, she felt a profound sense of rightness. The best victories are often the ones that leave scars. The most crucial fights are often waged by those who have already lost everything. And sometimes, mercy and justice are 2 sides of the same coin, tossed in a dusty cabin, leaving the world a little safer than it was before.